Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Laura and today I'm going to show you how to paint a house in watercolour. Let's get started. Hopefully you can see the outline sketch that I've drawn on my paper. Because of the transparent nature of watercolour, I have erased any harsh lines so they won't show through my painting. The best way of doing this is by using a kneadable eraser. For any structural drawing or painting, it's really important to get the dimensions and perspective right first time. To achieve this, I have created a sketch on graph paper and then transferred that to my watercolour paper using a light box. If you don't have a light box, transfer or tracing paper would work just as well. The first step is to add a light wash of colour. I'm using Mountain Blue and I'm being really careful to stay within my guidelines. I am using a size 8 round brush, which is quite large, but it has a really nice tip for detail. But if you're more comfortable using something smaller, then please do go with that. Blocking in the initial colour took a while, so I'm going to fast forward through some of the longer bits of this video so that you don't get too bored. The next step is to block in the colour for the roof, and for this I'm using Payne's Grey. I'm also going to use a tissue to soak up some colour after finishing each section of the roof. The purpose of this is to give the roof some variation in colour, and the best way that I found to do it is to scrunch up a tissue very lightly and blot gently on the surface of the paper. I'll be adding more detail to the roof later on. If you tend to lean your hand on the paper like me, then make sure that the blue area is dry before moving on to this stage. I tend to use a hairdryer, or you can use a heat tool as well on low to speed up this process. Next, I'm going back in with the same Mountain Blue as the front of the house, and I'm adding a darker shade below the roofline. Remember that this bit will be in shadow due to the overhang of the roof. What I'm doing here is loading up my brush with colour and applying it to the top half. Then I'm washing my brush, blotting any excess water and using a damp brush to blend that colour downwards. This way I don't end up with any harsh lines. I'm the type of painter who likes to build up colour slowly using layers, and that's probably because I'm still a beginner, but I think it's a really good way to learn. Also, the nature of watercolours lends itself so well to layering, especially as colours generally dry much lighter when they're first applied. You can have much more control. Now I'm going in and I'm adding some detail to the door using a lighter wash of Payne's Grey. My reference picture has a glass insert that looks like it has a really intricate design, but it's really not that clear. So I'm going to go for a plain glass insert to make this as easy as possible. I've also switched to a size 4 round brush at this point to make it easier to paint an accurate shape. I'm going to use the same colour to add a little shading and definition to the gutters, window frames and the door frame. Whilst these look white in my reference, there's so many variations of white, and whites usually have a hint of grey, so it's really important to look at your reference and identify these colours. I'm now going in with a darker mix of Payne's Grey, which is essentially more pigment and less water. And what I'm doing is essentially stippling this colour onto the roof. My reference image has a very dark roof that it just wouldn't look right, so I'm making that a little bit lighter. It also looks like it has tiles. However, I really don't think it's necessary to adding all this detail to my painting, and instead I'm aiming for more of an impression of texture and light and shade. I'm going back in and adding further detail to the door by outlining the glass. I'll come back in later and add a darker value to the glass as well as reflections. I'm also adding in the door handle and window panes. I've switched to an even smaller brush for this, a size 1 round, so that I can get the shapes as accurate as possible. Take your time on this bit because it's really tricky to draw straight lines. As much as you think it might be easy, it's really not. So take your time, and it's possible to tidy things up in the end, so really don't worry if you do go outside the lines. I'll explain how to do this at the end of the video. The windows in the middle have a reflection of the grass and sky in them, as well as being partially in shadow. So for now, I'm only blocking in dark grey where I see this on my reference picture, and I'll come back and add the reflections later once dry. As mentioned earlier, I'm coming back to the glass on the door and adding a darker layer. I'm using exactly the same Payne's grey, apart from a bit of a darker mix, so more pigment, less water. I'm also not covering the whole shape so that it gives the impression of a reflection, and I'm blotting that slightly as well just to add to that effect. I'm now moving on to the shutters on the windows, and for the colour for this I'm using Prussian blue and Schminke's Payne's grey bluish. These two mixed together create a really nice colour combination with the outside of the house. I'm using my smallest brush again just to make this as easy as possible, and this is really a good time to straighten up any of those lines around it. Moving back to the roof, I'm going in with a mixture of Payne's grey and neutral tint to create shadows. Neutral tint has a slight purple hue to it, which makes it perfect for shadows. Generally, I find that anything with a purple or a blue hue is great for this kind of detail. You'll probably notice that the first shadow I painted dried much lighter than I expected, so I used a more intense mix for the other shadows and then went back over my original shadow. I'm going back into the shadows under the top windows. I really want these to stand out, so I'm using the same technique I used to darken the values on the front of the house by blending the colour down with a damp brush. I think the more I can get this to look like the reference picture, the more realistic this part of the house will look. Now that my window panes are dry, I can go back in and add the green and blue reflections to the glass. To be honest, I'm not sure how well this worked and whether I would do it again if I had to repaint this. I don't hate it, but I don't think it was quite the effect that I was looking for. I filled in the rest of the window panes with a mix of Winsor green and then dotted in Prussian blue to the wet paint, and this created a mottled effect. Again, I'm adding another layer of my Payne's grey mix to the shadows on the top windows. Layering this way can really give you more control to the final result. I'm adding the same dark grey to the top window panes. There really aren't any strong reflections in these on my reference pictures, so I'm just blocking these in with the same mix. To add more depth to the roof, I'm going back into the shadow and adding a darker value where the deepest shadows will be. If you really look at a shadow, it's generally deeper right beneath the object, and then the colour diffuses as it gets further away, and that's the effect that I'm trying to achieve. I'm going back in to add some depth beneath the roofline, but instead of using another layer of mountain blue, I'm using a mixture of mountain blue and Payne's grey bluish, and this gives a really nice blue tinged shadow. I'm also making this darker on the outside sections of the house because these are set back further from the main portion of the house. So now I'm going in and I'm adding the detail to the shutters on the windows. I'm using my smallest brush so that I've got more control, and I'm using a more concentrated version of the blue that I used for the shutters originally. I'm creating lines on them to give the impression of slats of wood. You might notice that the light changes at this point, and that's because this part was actually filmed on the next day. I got a really late night the night before doing the first part of this painting. I'm not the fastest painter in the world, and because I'm still learning, I really like to take my time. Just as an example, the first section of this painting took me almost 2 hours to complete. Moving on, I'm now adding some foliage to my painting, and to be honest, I was really worried about ruining the whole thing at this point. Trees are not my strong point, but hopefully it works out. I'm using a mix of Winsor green, sap green and hooker's green dark, and to achieve a tree-like effect, I'm loading my brush with a lot of colour initially and using a stippling motion. By not loading my brush again as I move up the tree, it creates colour variations, and that helps to make it look a lot more natural. I'm then also going to use a more watery colour for the top of the tree, and that gives the impression of more light hitting this point. To make my painting more interesting, I'm also adding some small bushes to the front of the house. I'm using exactly the same colours as the trees, as well as the same technique. It's important to try not to make these look too uniform. You think of bushes in your head and you think of these round objects, but actually they're really not. There are wonky bushes and stray leaves, and it's really important to paint it as you see it, and it helps to make it look a lot more natural. To add a little more interest to these bushes, I'm using a mixture of rose madder and purple lake, and I'm dotting these on to create the impression of flowers. I'm then adding a mixture of burnt umber and Vandyke brown, and I'm using this to create the flower beds as well as the tree trunk. I'm using a lighter shade of the previous brown mix to paint in a doormat. Remember that you will need to take account of the perspective for this, so it will be smaller at the back towards the door and will be bigger as it comes towards us. So it can be really useful to sketch this out first so that you don't end up with any nasty surprises. Using the same perspective, I'm adding in a path to the door using a light mix of raw sienna. I don't want to block the colour in all the way to the edge of the paper, and so when I've painted down to within an inch of where I want the edge to be, I'm going to use some plain water on my brush and pull that colour down and blend it out to soft faded edges. I'm using the same technique for the grass, but I'm also dotting in some colour nearest to the house, and this just adds to the impression that this part is further away from us. You can probably see at this point that I've got some issues going on with the left-hand portion of the grass beneath the tree. I really messed this up here, and I tried to add water to blend the colour a little more when part of it had already dried, and it's a massive no-no, and it left me with these uneven patches. There is a way to fix this, and that's to wait until it's fully dry and then go over the whole area with a really wet brush. This helps to reactivate the paint underneath and can allow you to blend away the mistake. It doesn't always work, especially if you've used really staining colours, but it's definitely worth a try. So we're on to the last step. I mentioned earlier that if your lines had become a little messy, there were ways to adjust it. And to do this, as well as adding some highlights, I'm using a Posca pen in white. And that's it, we're done. I'm really pleased with how this one turned out, and it's the first house I've painted, so it's got me itching to try out some more architectural or structural designs. All of the materials that I've used today are listed in the description, as well as any links where possible. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please leave me a thumbs up and consider subscribing. I'm just starting out here with my channel, and I'm excited to continue sharing my journey learning how to watercolour. Have a great day, and thanks for watching.